The desert doesn't forgive, and it never forgets. When rancher Daniel Cross pulled back those palm fronds, he expected to find death. What he found was a woman half buried in her own grave, whispering a plea that would haunt him forever. "Bury me here." Her trembling hands clutched a cross burned into her flesh, and in that moment Daniel didn't know he was unearthing a secret that would connect him to a massacre, a ghost, and a choice between justice and damnation. Stay with me until the end and comment your city below so I can see how far this story travels. The Arizona Territory had a way of breaking men before it killed them. Daniel Cross had learned that truth the hard way watching his brother Samuel ride off into the Copper Hills 5 years ago with a promise to return before winter. Samuel never came back. The desert swallowed him whole the way it swallowed everything, hope water, the weak and the foolish. Now, in the scorching August of 1882, Daniel rode through the same unforgiving landscape, searching not for his brother's ghost, but for 3 head of cattle that had wandered from his ranch during the night. The sun hammered down like a blacksmith's anvil, and his horse, a stubborn roan named Jeremiah, snorted complaints with every step. "I know, boy," Daniel muttered, wiping sweat from his brow with a bandana that had gone from blue to brown months ago. "I don't like it either." The valley ahead shimmered with heat waves, distorting the ruins of the old San Miguel mission into something that looked more like a fever dream than a building. Daniel had avoided this place for years. Everyone did. The mission had been abandoned after the Apache raids of '76, and locals whispered that the souls of the murdered priests still wandered its crumbling walls, searching for the congregation that never came to save them. Superstition, Daniel told himself, nothing but stories to scare children. But as Jeremiah picked his way through the scattered debris, broken pottery, a rusted bell half buried in sand, the skeletal remains of a wagon wheel, Daniel felt the familiar prickle of unease crawl up his spine. Something was wrong here. The air felt too still, too heavy, like the moment before a storm breaks. Then he saw them, the palm fronds. They shouldn't have been there. Palms didn't grow wild in this part of the territory. Someone had planted them years ago, perhaps, when the mission still breathed with life. But now they stood like sentinels around a small clearing, their dried leaves rustling in a wind Daniel couldn't feel. And beneath those fronds, something was moving. Daniel's hand dropped instinctively to the Colt revolver on his hip as he dismounted. His boots crunched against the sand, each step deliberate, measured. The movement came again, weak, desperate, barely more than a flutter. "Anyone there?" His voice cracked the silence like a gunshot. No answer, just that pitiful stirring. Daniel approached slowly, his shadow falling across the palm fronds. When he was close enough to touch them, he hesitated. Every instinct screamed at him to mount Jeremiah and ride away to let the desert keep its secrets. But Daniel Cross had been raised by a father who believed that turning your back on suffering was the same as pulling the trigger yourself. He reached down and pulled back the first layer of fronds. A hand emerged from beneath, small, brown, caked with dried blood and sand. Daniel's breath caught. He dropped to his knees and began tearing away the palm fronds with both hands, his heart hammering against his ribs. More of the hand appeared then, a wrist, an arm, a shoulder, a woman. She lay in a shallow depression in the sand, her body curled into itself like a child seeking warmth. Her dress, once white perhaps, or cream, was shredded and stained with blood and dirt. Her black hair spread around her head like a dark halo, matted with sand, and what Daniel realized with horror were pieces of dried flesh. "Jesus Christ," he whispered. Her eyes fluttered open. Daniel jerked backward, nearly falling. He'd been so certain she was dead that seeing those eyes, brown and deep as canyon shadows, fixed on his face sent shock flooding through his system. Her lips moved. No sound came out at first, just a dry clicking as her tongue struggled against dehydration. Daniel fumbled for his canteen, uncapping it with shaking hands. "Easy," he said, sliding one hand beneath her head. to lift it slightly. Easy now. He pressed the canteen to her lips and let a few drops of water fall into her mouth. She swallowed, reflexively coughed, then opened her mouth for more. Daniel gave her another small sip, watching as consciousness slowly sharpened in her eyes. "Who did this to you?" The question came out harder than he'd intended. The woman's gaze fixed on him with an intensity that made Daniel's skin crawl. Then her lips moved again, and this time sound emerged, a whisper so faint he had to lean closer to hear it. "Bury me here." Daniel froze. "What? Bury me here?" She repeated, stronger now. Her hand, the one he'd first uncovered, rose from the sand and clutched at his shirt with surprising strength. "Please, I'm already meant to die. Just bury me here." "The hell I will." Daniel pulled back, breaking her grip. "Lady, I don't know what happened to you, but they'll come back." Her voice cracked with urgency, with terror. "When they find I'm not dead, they'll come back and finish." She dissolved into coughing, her whole body convulsing with the effort. Daniel could see now the full extent of her injuries, deep lacerations across her arms and torso, bruises blooming purple and yellow across her collarbone, and his stomach turned a mark on her left shoulder that looked like it had been burned into her skin. A cross, perfect and deliberate. "Who did this?" Daniel asked again, softer now. "Who's coming back?" But the woman had slipped back into unconsciousness, her hand falling limply to the sand. For a long moment Daniel knelt there, paralyzed by indecision. Every practical bone in his body told him to leave her. Getting involved in someone else's violence was a good way to end up dead yourself, and he had enough ghosts haunting his conscience without adding whatever hell this woman had escaped. But then he looked at the depression in the sand where she lay, and his blood went cold. It wasn't a natural hollow. Someone had dug it, not deep, maybe a foot and a half, but deliberately carved into the earth. The edges were too straight, too purposeful, and the palm fronds hadn't fallen there by accident. They'd been arranged carefully, placed to cover what lay beneath. Someone had dug this woman's grave while she was still breathing, and whoever they were, they'd expected her to die in it. Daniel's hands began to tremble. He looked down at the woman's face, peaceful now, in unconsciousness, and made a decision that he knew might cost him everything. "Damn me for a fool," he muttered, and gathered her into his arms. She was lighter than he expected, or perhaps adrenaline made her seem so. Daniel carried her to where Jeremiah waited, the horse's ears flicking nervously at the smell of blood. It took some maneuvering to get the woman draped across the saddle. She moaned once, a sound of such pure agony that Daniel nearly dropped her, but eventually he managed. He was about to mount behind her when something caught his eye. There at the edge of the shallow grave, partially covered by sand, a piece of fabric. Daniel crouched and pulled it free. It was a strip of cloth torn from a shirt perhaps, and on it was embroidered a symbol that made his heart stop. 2 crossed rifles over a setting sun. Daniel had seen that symbol before, years ago, on a saddlebag that had belonged to his brother Samuel. The desert wind picked up, sending sand skittering across the ground and making the palm fronds rattle like bones. In the distance, thunder rumbled despite the cloudless sky. Daniel stuffed the cloth into his pocket, mounted Jeremiah behind the unconscious woman, and turned the horse toward home. As they rode away from the mission ruins, he couldn't shake the feeling that he'd just unearthed something far more dangerous than a dying woman. He'd unearthed the past, and the past, Daniel knew, never stayed buried for long. The ride back to the ranch took 3 hours, during which the woman drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes moaning, sometimes muttering in Spanish, too rapid for Daniel to follow. He kept one arm wrapped around her waist to keep her from falling, the other holding Jeremiah's reins, and tried not to think about the blood soaking through his shirt. By the time his ranch appeared on the horizon, a modest house of adobe and timber, a barn that leaned slightly to the left, a corral that housed 2 other horses and a temperamental mule. The sun had begun its descent toward the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that reminded Daniel uncomfortably of fire and blood. He managed to dismount without dropping the woman, though it was a near thing. She'd stopped making sounds about an hour ago, and her skin had gone clammy and pale. Daniel carried her into the house, kicking open the door with more force than necessary, and laid her on the only bed, his bed. "All right," he said to the empty room, trying to steady his nerves. "All right, you've stitched up horses, you've stitched up yourself. This is no different." But it was different, and he knew it. Daniel spent the next 2 hours working by lamplight, cleaning wounds, applying whiskey as a disinfectant, and taking a long pull from the bottle for his own nerves, and doing his best to patch together flesh that had been torn apart with a violence that made his hands shake. The cross-shaped burn on her shoulder was the worst. It had been done with a branding iron. He was certain he'd seen enough cattle brands to recognize the pattern. But this wasn't a simple mark of ownership. This was a message. When he'd done all he could, Daniel sat back in the rickety chair beside the bed and studied the woman's face. She was young, he realized, couldn't be more than 25, maybe younger. Beautiful in a way that seemed almost defiant given what she'd endured. High cheekbones, a strong jaw, lips that even cracked and bleeding suggested laughter in better times. "Who are you?" Daniel whispered to the darkness. As if in answer, the woman's eyes flew open. She stared at the ceiling for a moment, breathing hard, then her gaze snapped to Daniel with such sudden intensity that he nearly fell out of his chair. "Where?" Her voice was a rasp. "Where am I?" "My ranch, about 3 hours east of the San Miguel mission." Daniel kept his voice calm, steady. "You're safe here." "Safe." She repeated the word like it was foreign, like she was testing its weight. Then she tried to sit up, gasped in pain, and collapsed back onto the pillow. "Easy," Daniel said, reaching out instinctively to steady her. "You've got more stitches than a quilt right now. You need to rest." "I can't rest." Her eyes filled with tears, but they were tears of frustration, not pain. I have to go back. I have to find what? My son." The words hit Daniel like a physical blow. He'd been so focused on her injuries, on getting her to safety, that it hadn't occurred to him she might have been running toward something instead of just away. "How old?" The question came out rougher than he intended. 4. His name is Diego." The tears spilled over now, cutting clean tracks through the dirt still caked on her face. "They took him during the attack. I tried to find him. I searched everywhere, but there was so much smoke and screaming and—" She choked on a sob. "I heard him calling for me. I heard him and I couldn't reach him." Daniel's throat tightened. "The attack on the mission." She nodded, not trusting her voice. "When was this? 2 days ago, maybe 3. I lost time. 2 days. She'd been lying in that shallow grave for 2 days, barely clinging to life, and all she could think about was her child." Daniel stood abruptly, needing to move, to do something with the rage that was building in his chest. "These men who attacked, did you see them? Could you identify them?" The woman's expression changed, fear flickering across her features before being replaced by something harder, colder. "I saw one of them," she said quietly. "I'll never forget his face." "What did he look like?" She closed her eyes, and Daniel watched her physically brace herself against the memory. When she spoke again, her voice had gone flat, emotionless, the voice of someone who had already died inside and was just waiting for the body to catch up. Tall, blonde hair long enough to touch his collar, blue eyes, very pale. He had a scar here. She traced a line across her left cheek, and he wore a cross around his neck, silver with a red stone in the center. Daniel's world tilted. He knew that description, knew it like he knew his own reflection. "No," he whispered. The woman's eyes opened. "What?" "Nothing." Daniel turned away, walking to the window so she wouldn't see his face. "You need rest. We'll talk more in the morning." "I told you my son's name." Her voice stopped him at the door. "What's yours?" Daniel hesitated, then Daniel Cross. "Cross." She repeated it slowly, and something in her tone made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. "Is that common, that name? Common enough?" I see. A pause. Then, my name is Maria Estrella. Daniel nodded without turning around. Rest, Maria Estrella. Tomorrow we'll figure out what comes next. He left the room before she could ask any more questions, closing the door behind him with a soft click. In the main room of the cabin, with only the dying embers of the fireplace for light, Daniel pulled the strip of cloth from his pocket and stared at the symbol embroidered there. 2 crossed rifles over a setting sun, the mark of the crossmen, the mark of his brother's gang, the mark of men who called themselves patriots while they murdered and burned and branded their victims like cattle. Daniel had thought that chapter of his life was over. Samuel had been dead for 3 years, killed in a shootout with the law down in Sonora, or so the story went. But now, holding this piece of cloth, listening to Maria describe a man who sounded exactly like his brother Daniel, felt the foundations of his carefully constructed peace beginning to crack. If Samuel was alive, if Samuel was the one who had attacked the mission, if Samuel was the one who had branded a cross into Maria's shoulder and left her to die in a shallow grave, then everything Daniel thought he knew about his brother, about himself, was a lie. Thunder rolled across the desert, again closer now. Daniel walked to the window and stared out at the darkness, watching lightning illuminate the distant mountains in brief, violent flashes. A storm was coming, and Daniel had a terrible feeling it had been building for years. The storm broke just before dawn, rain hammering against the roof in sheets that sounded like judgment itself. Daniel hadn't slept. He'd spent the night in the chair by the fireplace, the strip of cloth laid across his palm like evidence at a trial, turning over memories he'd spent 3 years trying to bury. Samuel Cross had been everything Daniel wasn't: charismatic, where Daniel was quiet; bold, where Daniel was cautious; loved, where Daniel was merely tolerated. Their father had seen it too, had favored Samuel so openly that by the time Daniel turned 16, he'd stopped trying to compete for affection and simply accepted his role as the shadow to his brother's light. When Samuel rode off that winter morning in 1879, Daniel had been relieved. Guilty about the relief, but relieved nonetheless. And when word came 6 months later that Samuel had been killed in Mexico, shot down by federales, while robbing a church, Daniel had felt something even worse than relief. He'd felt free. Now, staring at that symbol, those crossed rifles that Samuel had always said represented the twin barrels of justice and righteousness, Daniel felt the weight of his brother's ghost settling back onto his shoulders like a yoke. A sound from the bedroom made him look up. Maria was awake. He could hear her moving, hear the soft gasps of pain as she tried to shift position. Daniel stood, his joints protesting after a night in the chair, and crossed to the bedroom door. "You should stay still," he said without opening it. "I need to use the privy." Her voice was stronger than last night, but edged with embarrassment. Daniel closed his eyes. Of course. He'd been so focused on keeping her alive that he hadn't thought about basic necessities. "There's a chamber pot under the bed. I'll be outside." He grabbed his hat and stepped out onto the porch, letting the rain soak him. It felt cleansing, this cold desert rain that came maybe twice a year, if you were lucky. Daniel tilted his face to the sky and tried to wash away the memory of Samuel's last letter, the one that had arrived 2 weeks before news of his death. "Little brother," it had said, "I've found my calling. We're making the frontier safe for decent folk, clearing out the filth that's been poisoning this territory. You'd be proud of the work we're doing, righteous work, God's work." Daniel had burned that letter the day it arrived. The bedroom door opened behind him. He turned to find Maria standing in the doorway, one hand braced against the frame for support. She'd managed to wash her face, and without the mask of blood and dirt, Daniel could see the full extent of the bruising across her jaw and cheekbone. "You shouldn't be up," he said. "I've been lying down for 3 days. She took a careful step onto the porch, wincing. "If I stay in that bed any longer, I'll go mad." The rain was already soaking through her borrowed nightshirt, one of Daniel's old ones, comically large on her small frame. He moved to help her back inside, but she waved him off with surprising sharpness. "I'm not made of glass, Mr. Cross." "No," Daniel agreed, studying the steel in her eyes. "I don't imagine you are." They stood there in the rain for a moment, two strangers bound together by violence and circumstance, until Maria finally spoke. "You recognize the description I gave you last night, the man with the scar?" It wasn't a question. Daniel should have known she'd be too smart to miss his reaction. "Maybe," he said carefully. "Don't lie to me." Maria's voice cut like a blade. "I've had enough of lies. If you know something about the men who took my son, about the men who killed everyone, Her voice broke, but she forced it steady again. "If you know something, I deserve to hear it." Daniel looked at her, really looked at her, and saw something he recognized, the same thing he saw in his own mirror every morning. Guilt, the kind that burrowed into your bones and made a home there. "Come inside," he said. "This is going to take a while." They sat at the small table in the main room, Maria moving like every breath hurt, Daniel pouring coffee that had gone bitter from sitting on the stove all night. Outside, the rain continued its assault, turning the desert into a sea of mud. "My brother's name was Samuel Cross," Daniel began, his hands wrapped around his tin cup. "He left home 5 years ago to join up with a group of men who called themselves vigilantes, claimed they were protecting settlers from bandits and raiders, called themselves the Crossmen." Maria's face went pale. "The Crossmen," she whispered. "That's what they said. When they rode into the mission, they said they were the Crossmen, and they were there to cleanse the valley of Mexican filth." The words hit Daniel like a punch to the gut. Christ. There were maybe 30 people at the mission that day. Maria continued, her voice hollow. "Families who'd come for the feast day. My husband Carlos, he was helping Father Miguel repair the bell tower. Diego was playing with the other children in the courtyard. Everything was normal. Everything was..." She trailed off, staring at something Daniel couldn't see. He waited, knowing she needed to tell this, needed to bleed the poison out. They came at noon. 8 men on horses, all wearing red bandanas across their faces, but their leader, he didn't cover his face. He wanted us to see him, wanted us to remember. Maria's hand went unconsciously to the burn on her shoulder. He said we were harboring criminals, said the mission was a nest of vipers that needed to be purged. Father Miguel tried to reason with him, said we were peaceful people just trying to live. The leader shot him in the head. Daniel's coffee had gone cold in his hands. After that, it was chaos. They started shooting anyone who ran. Carlos, my husband, he grabbed Diego and tried to get him to the bell tower somewhere high where he could hide. I saw one of the men shoot Carlos in the back. He fell and Diego... Maria's voice cracked. Diego was screaming. I tried to get to him, but someone grabbed me, held me while their leader came over. He looked at me like I was nothing, like I was less than nothing, and then he took out his branding iron from the fire they'd built, and he said, "You need to be marked, so God knows which side you're on." Daniel felt sick. Maria. He burned me while 2 men held me down. I could smell my own flesh cooking, and the whole time he was smiling and saying this was God's justice, that we'd brought this on ourselves by refusing to leave when we'd been warned. She looked up at Daniel and her eyes were dry now, all tears burned away by rage. Then he told his men to dig graves for the bodies. But I wasn't dead yet. I begged them to kill me to finish it, but the leader said no. He said I needed to lie in my grave and think about my sins. Said if I was righteous, God would save me. If not, I'd die knowing I deserved it. Jesus Christ, Daniel breathed. They made me watch while they searched the mission. I heard Diego crying from somewhere, heard them laughing, heard... She stopped, swallowed hard. Then they threw me in the hole they dug and covered me with palm fronds. Said the desert would decide my fate. The rain had slowed to a steady patter. In the silence that followed, Daniel could hear water dripping through a leak in the roof. each drop marking time like a heartbeat. "The man you described," he finally said, "the one with the scar and the silver cross, that was Samuel, my brother." Maria's eyes widened. Was he supposed to be dead, killed 3 years ago in Mexico? Daniel pulled the strip of cloth from his pocket and laid it on the table between them. "But this is his symbol, and if you saw him 2 days ago, then he's alive." Maria reached for the cloth, her fingers trembling as she touched the embroidered rifles. "And he has my son." "We don't know that. The boy could have—" "Don't." Maria's voice was sharp. "Don't you dare say he could be dead. He's alive. I'd know if he wasn't. A mother knows." Daniel wanted to argue, wanted to prepare her for the likelihood that a 4-year-old boy wouldn't have survived a massacre. But looking at Maria's face, at the desperate hope mixed with iron determination, he found he couldn't take that from her. "All right," he said instead. "Then we need to figure out where Samuel would have taken him. If he took him." Maria stood too fast and had to grab the table to keep from falling. "One of them said something before they left, said something about the compound and training them young. I didn't understand then, but now—" "A compound?" Daniel's mind raced. Samuel used to talk about building a place, a fortress where true Americans could live without government interference. I always thought it was just talk. But if he's been alive all this time, where would he build it? I don't know, somewhere remote, somewhere with water. Daniel moved to the crude map tacked on his wall, studying the territory with new eyes. There are canyons to the north near the Gila River, lots of places to hide. If Samuel wanted to disappear, then that's where we go. Daniel turned to find Maria already moving toward the bedroom, her jaw set with determination that would have been admirable if it wasn't so clearly going to get her killed. "You can barely stand," he pointed out. "You're in no condition to—" "My son is out there with the men who murdered his father and tried to murder me." Maria's voice was cold, final. "I'm going to find him. You can help me or not, but I'm going. You'll die before you make it 10 miles. Then I'll die trying." She met his eyes. "Wouldn't you, if it was your child?" Daniel had no answer for that. He'd never had a child, never even come close to the kind of life that included a family. But looking at Maria, at the fierce love burning in her eyes, despite the pain and trauma and horror she'd endured, he felt something shift inside him. "Give me 3 days," he said. 3 days for you to heal enough to ride, for me to gather supplies and information. Then we'll go. 3 days is too long. 3 days is necessary if you don't want to collapse halfway there." Daniel crossed his arms. "I'm not your enemy, Maria, but I'm also not going to watch you kill yourself on some suicide mission. We do this smart, or we don't do it at all." They stared at each other, wills clashing like thunder. Finally, Maria looked away. 3 days, she agreed, but not a moment longer. Those 3 days passed in a strange, tense rhythm. Daniel rode into town under the pretense of buying supplies, but really to ask questions. The general store owner mentioned hearing about some trouble at the old San Miguel mission. The bartender at the saloon had heard rumors of a group of men running off a Mexican settlement near the border. Nobody knew names, nobody had details, but there was a pattern emerging. Violence always against Mexican families or individuals, always justified as frontier justice or protecting decent folk. Daniel returned to the ranch each evening to find Maria growing stronger, more determined. She'd taken to walking the property, despite his orders to rest, pushing herself until she nearly collapsed. He'd find her leaning against the fence posts, staring north toward the mountains where her son might be her face, set in lines of such fierce concentration it made his chest ache. On the second night, Daniel found her in the barn, going through the saddlebags he'd shoved in the back corner years ago. Samuel's saddlebags, the ones with the crossman symbol burned into the leather. "I should have burned these," Daniel said from the doorway. Maria didn't look up. "Why didn't you?" "I don't know. Sentiment maybe. Stupidity." He moved closer, watching her pull out the contents. a spare shirt, a whetstone, a flask that still smelled faintly of whiskey. Samuel was my brother. I couldn't quite let go. Even knowing what he was, I didn't know, not really. I suspected maybe, but I told myself he was just young and angry that he'd grow out of it. Daniel laughed bitterly. Funny how we lie to ourselves about the people we love. Maria pulled something else from the bag, a small leather journal, its pages yellowed and brittle. She opened it carefully, squinting at the handwriting in the dim lamplight. "What is that?" Daniel asked. "A record." Maria's voice was tight. "Dates, locations, names. Your brother kept a record of everyone they—" She couldn't finish. Daniel took the journal from her hands, flipping through pages filled with Samuel's neat script. Each entry was clinical detached. July 15th, 1879. Cleared the Rodriguez homestead. 7 souls sent to judgment. Praise be. September 3rd, 1879. Burned out the Sanchez family. 5 adults, 3 children. The valley is cleaner for it. The journal slipped from Daniel's fingers. He backed away, his stomach heaving, until he hit the barn wall. How many? Maria's voice seemed to come from very far away. How many people did he kill? Daniel couldn't answer. The numbers swam before his eyes, entry after entry, death after death. Dozens, maybe hundreds over the years, all catalogued with the same righteous certainty, the same cold pride. "This is evidence," Maria said, picking up the journal. "This could hang them all. If we can find them, if we can get anyone to care." Daniel's voice was hollow. "Most people in this territory think Mexicans are the problem. They'd probably give Samuel a medal. Then we don't go to the authorities." Maria's eyes were hard as flint. "We find your brother, we get my son, and then we make sure the crossmen never hurt anyone again. You're talking about murder. I'm talking about justice." Daniel looked at her, this small woman who should have been broken by everything she'd endured, and saw something that terrified him. She wasn't talking about revenge. She was talking about execution. Cold, calculated, final, and God help him, he was starting to think she was right. The third night arrived wrapped in unseasonable cold, the kind that made you remember winter was coming even in the desert. Daniel found Maria on the porch, wrapped in one of his jackets, staring at the stars. "Can't sleep?" he asked. "I keep having the same dream," she said quietly. "Diego is calling for me, but I can't find him. I run and run, but the desert just keeps getting bigger. And then I hear Samuel's voice saying, 'God has already decided his fate.'" She turned to look at Daniel. "What if we're too late? What if by the time we find him he's already—" "Don't." Daniel sat beside her close enough that their shoulders almost touched. "Don't go down that road. It'll eat you alive." "How do you stand it?" Maria's voice broke. "The not knowing. You spent 3 years thinking your brother was dead, and now you find out he's been alive this whole time doing those things. How do you live with that?" "Poorly," Daniel admitted. "I drink too much. I avoid people. I pretend that if I just keep my head down and work hard enough, I can outrun the past." He paused. "Doesn't work for the record." Maria laughed, a sound so unexpected and genuine that it startled both of them. "We're quite a pair, aren't we? The guilt-ridden brother and the woman who crawled out of her own grave." Sounds like the start of a bad joke, or a very sad song. Maria's smile faded. "Tomorrow we leave. Tomorrow we leave. And if we find them, if we find your brother and his men, what then?" Daniel had been asking himself the same question for 3 days. He'd always believed in law and order, in letting justice take its proper course. But he'd also seen what passed for justice in this territory, seen how men like Samuel could operate for years without consequence because their victims didn't matter to the people in power. "I don't know," he said honestly. "I suppose we'll figure it out when we get there. And if he won't give Diego back, if he fights." The question hung in the air between them. Daniel thought about the brother he'd loved, the boy who'd taught him to ride and shoot and track. Then he thought about the man who'd murdered families and branded women and kept a ledger of death like it was something to be proud of. "Then I'll do what needs to be done," Daniel said. "Blood or not, some things can't be forgiven." Maria reached out and took his hand. Her grip was strong despite the injuries, warm despite the cold night. "Thank you," she said simply. They sat like that until the stars began to fade, two broken people gathering the courage to face the demons waiting in the desert. When dawn finally broke, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, they rose together and began preparing for a journey that would change everything. Daniel saddled both horses while Maria packed supplies. As he tightened Jeremiah's cinch, his hand brushed against the saddlebag where Samuel's journal now rested. The physical weight was negligible, but the moral weight felt like it might crush him. "Ready?" Maria appeared beside him, dressed in men's clothes Daniel had scrounged from his closet. They were too big, but she'd belted them tight and tucked her hair under a hat. If you didn't look too close, she could pass for a young ranch hand. "No," Daniel said, "but I don't suppose that matters." They mounted up as the sun cleared the horizon, casting long shadows across the desert floor. Daniel took one last look at his ranch, the simple life he'd built from scraps and solitude. He had a feeling he wouldn't be seeing it again, at least not as the same man who'd left it. "North?" Maria asked, her horse dancing sideways with nervous energy. "North," Daniel confirmed, "and God help anyone who gets in our way." They rode out together, two souls bound by tragedy and purpose, heading toward a reckoning that had been 3 years in the making. Behind them, the ranch grew smaller and smaller until it disappeared, entirely swallowed by the endless desert. And ahead, somewhere in the copper canyons where God's light struggled to reach, Samuel Cross waited with a 4-year-old boy and an army of men who believed hate was holy. The storm had passed, but a darker one was coming, and this time Daniel knew the only shelter would be in the truth. The canyon country revealed itself slowly, like a secret the earth was reluctant to share. What had been flat desert gave way to rolling hills, then to deeper cuts in the land where water had carved paths over centuries. Daniel led them through arroyos and washes, following instincts half-remembered from childhood expeditions with Samuel when his brother had dragged him through every hidden corner of this territory, claiming they were explorers charting unknown lands. Now those childhood adventures felt like reconnaissance for something darker. They'd been riding for 2 days, stopping only when the horses needed rest, or when Maria's injuries forced her to admit she couldn't continue. She never complained, but Daniel could see the pain in the way she held herself, in the tight lines around her mouth when she thought he wasn't looking. Still, every time he suggested they slow down, she'd fix him with a look that could cut glass and nudge her horse forward. On the afternoon of the second day, they found the first sign. A burned-out homestead sat in a small valley, its adobe walls blackened and crumbling. The roof had collapsed inward, and the corral fence had been torn down, livestock long gone. Daniel dismounted, his hand instinctively moving to his rifle. "Stay here," he told Maria. Like hell. She was already off her horse, moving toward the ruins with grim determination. The house had been destroyed with methodical violence, every window smashed, every door torn from its hinges. Daniel found charred furniture inside, the remnants of a life interrupted. A child's wooden toy lay half buried in ash. He picked it up, turned it over in his hands, and felt his jaw tighten. "Daniel." Maria's voice came from outside, strained. He found her standing behind what had been the barn, staring at 3 wooden crosses planted in the hard ground, fresh enough that the wood hadn't weathered yet, old enough that whoever had buried the bodies was long gone. "The Delgado family," Maria said quietly. "They left the mission 2 weeks before the attack, said they wanted to try farming on their own." She knelt beside the crosses, her fingers tracing the names carved into the wood. Miguel Rosa and little Ana. She was 6. Daniel stood behind her, watching her shoulders shake with silent grief. "You knew them." "Rosa taught me to make tamales. Miguel played guitar at every feast day. Anna, Maria's voice broke. Anna wanted to be a nun when she grew up. The wind picked up whistling through the destroyed buildings like a mourner's keen. Daniel scanned the surrounding hills, the exposed feeling between his shoulder blades growing stronger with each passing moment. "We need to move," he said. "Being out in the open like this, they're watching us, aren't they?" Maria stood wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "The crossmen, they're watching to see what we'll do." Daniel had been thinking the same thing. Maybe, or maybe I'm just paranoid. Paranoia keeps you alive. Maria returned to her horse but paused before mounting. How far to the river? Half a day if we push, but Maria, if they are watching, then they already know we're coming. She swung into the saddle with a wince she tried to hide. Let them watch. Let them see what happens when you take a woman's child. They rode on as the sun began its descent, the shadows growing long and strange across the broken land. Daniel kept his rifle across his saddle, his eyes constantly scanning the ridgelines and rocky outcrops where a man with a gun could hide. Twice he thought he saw movement, the flash of sunlight on metal, or the brief silhouette of a rider, but when he looked directly, there was nothing. "Tell me about him," Maria said as they navigated a narrow wash. "Samuel, before he became what he is now." Daniel didn't want to answer, didn't want to humanize the man they were hunting. But something in Maria's voice suggested she needed to understand the enemy as more than just a monster. "He was funny," Daniel said finally, "always telling stories, making people laugh. Our mother died when we were young, and Samuel, he kind of took over that role. Made sure I ate, made sure I did my schoolwork, taught me everything our father was too drunk or too angry to teach. He protected you." "Yeah, until he didn't." Daniel guided Jeremiah around a fallen boulder. "When I was 14, some boys from town decided they didn't like me, said I was too quiet, too strange. They cornered me after church one Sunday, started pushing me around. Samuel found us. Beat all three of them so badly one lost an eye." Maria glanced at him. "And you?" "I was horrified. They were just kids being cruel the way kids are, but Samuel, he said they'd threatened his blood, and blood demanded blood. That's when I first saw it. That righteousness, that absolute certainty that his violence was justified." Daniel shook his head. "Our father praised him for it, said Samuel was finally becoming a man." "Is that when he started with the crossmen?" "No, that came later, after our father died and left the ranch to both of us. Samuel wanted to expand, wanted to build something bigger, but every time we tried to buy land, Mexican families already had claims, legal claims documented and everything. Samuel said it wasn't right, that this was American territory and Americans should own it. Started going to meetings, listening to men who said the only way to secure the frontier was to drive out the invaders." Daniel's hands tightened on the reins. "I told him he was wrong, told him those families had as much right to be here as we did. We fought about it for months. Then one morning I woke up and he was gone, left a note saying he'd found his true calling. And you let him go." It wasn't an accusation, just a statement, but it cut Daniel deeper than any blade. "I let him go," he confirmed, "told myself it was his life, his choice. Sold the ranch and moved out here where I wouldn't have to think about what he might be doing. Convinced myself that if I didn't see it, it wasn't my responsibility. But it was." "Yeah," Daniel's voice was hollow. "It was." They rode in silence after that, the weight of complicity settling over Daniel like a shroud. He'd spent 3 years pretending his brother's choices weren't his burden to bear. But looking at Maria at the brand burned into her shoulder, and the desperate hope in her eyes every time she scanned the horizon for some sign of her son, Daniel knew the truth. Every person Samuel had killed, every family he'd destroyed, every child he'd orphaned, Daniel shared that guilt. Because he'd known. Maybe not the specifics, but he'd known Samuel's heart. known the darkness growing there, and he'd chosen to look away. The Gila River appeared as the sun touched the western mountains, a ribbon of green cutting through the copper landscape. Daniel had been right about the water drawing people. Even from a distance, they could see the signs of habitation fields carved from the floodplain, a few scattered buildings, smoke rising from cooking fires. "Is that it?" Maria asked, her voice tight with hope and fear. The compound, no. Too open, too exposed. Samuel would want somewhere he could defend. Daniel studied the terrain, remembering childhood stories his brother had told about secret forts and hidden valleys. "There's a canyon system about 3 miles upriver. Box canyon, narrow entrance, high walls. If I was building a fortress, that's where I'd do it." They approached the settlement carefully, Daniel's instincts screaming warnings. Something was wrong. Too quiet. No children playing, no dogs barking. Just that thin smoke rising into the darkening sky. "Stay behind me," Daniel said, drawing his rifle. The settlement consisted of maybe 5 buildings clustered around a central well. As they drew closer, Daniel could see that every door stood open, swinging slightly in the evening breeze. Every window was dark. "Hello," Daniel called out. "Anyone here?" His voice echoed off the buildings and died. No response. They dismounted, tying the horses to the well post. Daniel went to the nearest building, a small adobe house with a garden plot out front, where vegetables grew wild and untended. Inside, the table was set for dinner. Food still sat on the plates covered in flies. A pot on the stove had boiled dry, its contents blackened and stuck to the bottom. "They left in a hurry," Maria said from the doorway, "or they were taken." Daniel checked the other buildings and found the same scene repeated. Lives interrupted, mid-moment possessions left behind, no signs of struggle, but also no signs of voluntary departure. In the largest building, a combination general store and meeting hall, he found something that made his blood run cold. A message painted on the wall in what looked like ash and water: "The cleansing continues. The righteous remain." "Daniel," Maria's voice came from outside, sharp with urgency. He found her at the edge of the settlement, staring at the ground. Even in the fading light, he could see the tracks. Dozens of them, boot prints, horse prints, all heading north toward the canyon. "How many people lived here?" Maria asked. "Maybe 30. Families mostly trying to farm the river bottom. And they all just walked away." Daniel knelt, studying the tracks more closely. No drag marks, no signs of resistance, but also no wagon tracks, no indication anyone had taken belongings or supplies. They were herded, like cattle, to where? The canyon. Daniel stood, a terrible certainty settling in his gut. Samuel's gathering them. All the people he hasn't killed outright, he's collecting them. For what purpose? Daniel thought about his brother's journal, about the meticulous record-keeping and the religious fervor in every entry. "I don't know, but whatever it is, it's happening soon. Otherwise, why abandon this place? Why leave everything behind?" They returned to the horses, both of them understanding, without words, that they needed to move fast. The sun had fully set now, stars beginning to emerge in the darkening sky. Daniel knew they should make camp, wait for morning to approach the canyon. But looking at Maria's face, seeing the desperate calculation in her eyes, he knew she wouldn't wait. Couldn't wait. "We go in at night," Maria said. It wasn't a question. "It's suicide. We don't know the terrain, don't know how many men he has, don't know where they're keeping the prisoners, or Diego, or we go in at night." Maria repeated, her voice harder. "Because by morning they might all be dead." Daniel wanted to argue, wanted to be the voice of reason and caution, but he kept seeing that message on the wall. The cleansing continues. Samuel had always been a man of his word, for better or worse. If he'd promised a cleansing, he'd deliver one. "All right," Daniel said, checking his weapons with hands that only trembled slightly. "But we do this smart. Scout first, find out what we're dealing with. No heroics, no charging in blind." Agreed. Maria checked her own rifle, borrowed from Daniel's supplies. She'd proven herself a decent shot during their journey, practiced with the grim determination of someone who knew their life might depend on marksmanship. How long to the canyon? An hour on foot, less if we push. Then we push. They left the horses tied with water and fodder, taking only what they could carry. Daniel led them along the river, using the sound of running water to mask their footsteps. The moon rose nearly full, painting the landscape in silver and shadow. Beautiful if you didn't think too hard about what might be waiting ahead. The canyon mouth appeared like a wound in the earth, a narrow slash between the walls of stone that rose 50 feet on either side. Daniel could see firelight flickering deeper in, could hear voices carrying on the night air. He motioned for Maria to crouch beside him behind a boulder, and together they watched. Men moved in and out of the canyon entrance, all wearing red bandanas, all carrying rifles. Daniel counted at least 6 guards visible, which meant there were probably more he couldn't see. The entrance had been fortified with a rough gate made from timber and wire, and a watchtower had been constructed on the northern wall where a man with a rifle surveyed the approach. "We'll never get past that," Maria whispered. "Not through the front, no." Daniel studied the canyon walls, remembering something Samuel had told him years ago about a side passage, a crack in the rock that led to the canyon rim. But there might be another way. He led Maria east, parallel to the canyon, until they found what he was looking for, a narrow chimney in the rock face barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through. Daniel had climbed it once as a boy, following Samuel on some adventure he could barely remember. Now, looking at the vertical climb in the moonlight, it seemed impossible. "You're joking," Maria said. "I wish I was." Daniel tested the first handhold. The rock was solid, but it had been 20 years since he'd climbed anything more challenging than a ladder. "Stay here, I'll scout from above, come back and—" "We go together." Maria was already reaching for the rock. "I didn't come this far to sit and wait. Your injuries will hurt whether I'm climbing or sitting. At least this way I'm doing something." She looked at him, her eyes fierce in the moonlight. "My son is in there, Daniel. I'm going up." They climbed. Every foot gained felt like a victory and a torture. Daniel's muscles screamed. His hands bled from gripping the rough stone, and more than once his foot slipped and left him dangling by his fingers, while his heart tried to pound out of his chest. Behind him he could hear Maria's labored breathing, could hear the small sounds of pain she couldn't quite suppress. It took an hour to reach the top. Daniel pulled himself over the edge and collapsed, gasping, every muscle trembling. Maria emerged moments later and simply lay on her back staring at the stars while she fought to catch her breath. "Never," she panted. "Never again." "Agreed," Daniel managed. When they'd recovered enough to move, they crawled to the canyon edge and looked down into hell. The canyon had been transformed into a compound just as Daniel had suspected. Wooden structures lined the walls, barracks, storage buildings, what looked like a church or meeting hall. In the center, a large fire burned, and around it stood maybe 20 men, all armed, all wearing those damned red bandanas. But it was what lay beyond the fire that made Daniel's stomach turn. A pen, like something you'd use for livestock. And inside it, huddled together for warmth and comfort, were people. Men, women, children. Daniel counted at least 40, maybe more. The entire settlement they'd found abandoned, plus others. All of them prisoners. "Diego." Maria breathed beside him, and Daniel heard the tears in her voice. "I can't see him. There are too many people, too dark. I can't—" "We'll find him," Daniel promised, though he had no idea how. A door opened in the largest building and a man emerged. Even from this distance, even after 3 years, Daniel knew him instantly. The walk, the way he carried himself, the casual confidence that came from absolute certainty in your own righteousness. Samuel Cross was alive. And as Daniel watched his brother approach the pen, watched him survey the prisoners like a rancher checking his stock, he felt something fundamental break inside him. This wasn't a stranger, wasn't some monster in human form. This was Samuel, his brother, the boy who'd taught him to ride and shoot and track, the man who'd beaten 3 boys bloody for touching him. The same person, the same twisted sense of protection and violence all wound together until you couldn't separate the love from the hate. "Is that him?" Maria asked, though from Daniel's reaction she already knew. "Yeah," Daniel's voice was barely a whisper. "That's Samuel." They watched as Samuel addressed the prisoners, though they were too far away to hear his words. But Daniel could see the gestures, could see the way his brother's hands moved in patterns he remembered from childhood sermons their father used to drag them to. Samuel was preaching, justifying, explaining to his captives why their deaths would be righteous and necessary. Then Samuel stepped aside and two men dragged someone forward from the pen, a woman young, fighting with desperate strength. They forced her to her knees in front of Samuel, held her while he withdrew something from the fire. A branding iron. "No," Maria hissed. "No, no, no." The woman's scream cut through the night, like a knife, raw and primal and absolutely hopeless. Samuel held the iron to her shoulder for a count of 3, then stepped back and nodded. The men threw the woman back into the pen where others rushed to help her. "Tomorrow," Samuel's voice suddenly carried up to them loud and clear in the desert night. "Tomorrow we complete God's work. Tomorrow the valley is cleansed, and the righteous shall inherit the earth. Those who accept the mark will be spared. The rest—" He let the silence finish his sentence. The men around the fire cheered. The prisoners in the pen wept. And Daniel Cross, lying on the canyon rim beside a woman who'd crawled out of her own grave, finally understood what his brother had become. Not just a murderer, not just a fanatic, but something worse, a man who believed his hatred was holy, his violence divine, his judgment absolute. "We have to stop this," Maria said. "Tonight, before tomorrow comes. 2 of us against 20 armed men, we'd die before we reached the pen. Then we die." Maria turned to face him, and in the moonlight her face was terrible and beautiful at once. "But we die trying. Because if we don't, 40 people will burn tomorrow, including my son. You don't know he's down there." "Yes, I do." Maria pointed, and Daniel followed her finger to a small figure near the edge of the pen, partially hidden behind a woman's skirts. Even from this distance, even in the firelight, he could see the child's dark curls, the familiar shape of his face. "That's Diego. I'd know him anywhere." Daniel's mind raced, running through scenarios, discarding them as fast as they formed. There was no tactical solution, no clever plan that ended with them victorious and the prisoners freed. But looking at Maria, at the absolute determination in her eyes, he knew she was going whether he helped or not. "The gunpowder stores," Daniel said slowly. "Samuel always kept extra powder and dynamite for mining. If they're still using the same system, there'll be a storage shed on the eastern wall. A distraction, a big one. While everyone's dealing with the explosion, we grab Diego and as many others as we can and run for the side passage. And the rest—" Daniel didn't answer. They both knew most of the prisoners wouldn't make it, but saving some was better than saving none. "All right," Maria said. "How do we get down there?" They found a path, treacherous and narrow, that descended the inner canyon wall. Daniel went first, testing each handhold, each foothold, feeling rock crumble away under his weight. Twice he nearly fell. Once Maria did fall, sliding 10 feet before catching herself on a jutting stone, her gasp of pain quickly stifled. They reached the canyon floor behind the storage buildings hidden in shadow. Daniel could hear the men still gathered around the fire, could smell the smoke and sweat, and something else, fear, thick and cloying. The fear of the prisoners who knew tomorrow would bring death. "The shed's that way," Daniel whispered, pointing. "I'll set the charges. You get to the pen, find Diego, be ready to run when you hear the explosion." "Daniel, no time to argue. If this goes wrong, if I don't make it back, you get your son and you run. Understand?" Maria grabbed his hand, squeezed it once. "Don't die. I've gotten used to having you around. I'll do my best." He moved through the shadows like a ghost, his heart hammering so loud he was sure everyone could hear it. The powder shed was exactly where he remembered, tucked against the canyon wall with a simple padlock on the door. Daniel pulled out his knife and went to work. Behind him, Maria crept toward the pen where 40 souls waited for a dawn that would bring fire and judgment. And somewhere in that pen, a 4-year-old boy huddled against the cold, dreaming of his mother. The lock gave way with a soft click that sounded like thunder in Daniel's ears. He eased the door open, and the smell of gunpowder filled his nostrils. Inside, barrels and crates, just as he'd hoped. Enough explosive to bring down half the canyon. Daniel worked fast, setting fuses, connecting them together, hands shaking only slightly as he remembered skills learned long ago. When he was done, he had maybe 3 minutes before the whole shed went up. He struck a match. The fuse caught with a hiss and spark. And Daniel ran. He'd made it maybe 20 feet when a voice behind him said, "Hello, little brother." Daniel froze, turned. Samuel stood in the firelight, that familiar smile on his face, but the eyes above it were dead cold as stones at the bottom of a well. "I knew you'd come," Samuel said, raising his rifle. "I've been waiting for you." And as the fuse burned down toward oblivion, Daniel Cross faced his brother for the last time. Time seemed to stop in the space between heartbeats. Daniel stared at his brother, at the rifle pointed steady at his chest, and felt the weight of 3 years of lies crushing down on him. Behind Samuel, the fuse continued its inexorable journey toward the powder shed, sparking and hissing like a snake warning of the strike to come. "You look surprised," Samuel said, that familiar smile never wavering. "Did you really think I wouldn't recognize your horse tied up at the settlement? Same roan gelding you've had since you were 16. You always were sentimental about the strangest things, Danny." "Don't call me that." Daniel's hand hovered near his own weapon, calculating distances, angles, the probability of drawing and firing before Samuel pulled his trigger. The math didn't favor him. "Why not, it's your name, or have you forgotten who you are, forgotten where you came from?" Samuel took a step closer, his boots crunching on the gravel. "I heard you were out here hiding in the desert like some kind of hermit, running from your blood, from your duty." "My duty?" Daniel's voice came out strangled. "You murdered families, women, children. I read your journal, Samuel. I saw what you've done." "What I've done?" Samuel's laugh was sharp, bitter. "What we've done, brother. Every acre of land Americans own in this territory we paid for with blood and righteousness. I'm just honest enough to admit it." Behind Daniel, somewhere in the darkness, Maria would be reaching the pen. He needed to keep Samuel talking, needed to buy her time. The fuse was maybe 2 minutes from the powder now, maybe less. "You were supposed to be dead," Daniel said. "They told me federales killed you in Mexico. They tried, shot me 3 times, left me for dead in a ditch outside Hermosillo." Samuel pulled down his collar, revealing a puckered scar just above his collarbone. "But God had other plans. A priest found me, nursed me back to health. Funny thing about that priest, he was the one who showed me the error of my ways." "What ways?" "The ways that kept you from murdering innocent people. The ways that made me think mercy was virtue." Samuel's eyes glinted in the firelight. That priest, he was one of them. A Mexican ministering to his own kind, turning a blind eye to the criminals and savages hiding in his church. I realized then that God had saved me for a reason, to finish the work I'd started, to cleanse this land so decent people could live without fear. Daniel felt sick. "That priest saved your life, and I repaid him by sending him to God's judgment where he belonged." Samuel gestured with the rifle toward the pen. "Is that why you're here, for them, or did you bring someone with you?" His smile widened. "I know you didn't come alone. My men saw 2 riders approach the settlement, so where is she, Danny? Where's the woman who crawled out of her grave?" Daniel's blood went cold. "I don't know what you're talking about. Please, I'm many things, but I'm not stupid. Maria Estrella, the one who survived the San Miguel mission. I should have made sure she was dead, but I thought the desert would finish what I started." Samuel's expression hardened. She should have stayed buried. Coming back here, bringing you into this now, you've forced my hand. She just wants her son. The boy, Samuel, seemed genuinely puzzled. He's being raised properly now, learning what it means to be part of something greater than himself. In a few years, he'll thank me for saving him from a life of degradation and poverty. You killed his father, you branded his mother and left her to die. I gave them both chances to accept the mark, to join the righteous. They refused. Samuel's voice was matter-of-fact, as if discussing the weather, their choices, their consequences. The boy, though he's young enough to be saved, to be taught the truth. Daniel could feel the seconds ticking away, could almost hear the fuse burning closer to oblivion. He needed to end this conversation, needed to either shoot his brother or run or something, anything, but his body wouldn't move. Because despite everything, despite the journal and the murders and the madness part of him, still saw the boy who'd protected him, who'd taught him to ride, who'd been the only family he had after their parents died. Samuel, Daniel said quietly, it's not too late. Let these people go. Take your men and leave. I'll tell the authorities you headed south, buy you time to disappear. But you can't do this. You can't kill 40 innocent people. Innocent? Samuel's laugh was harsh. There's no such thing as innocent in war, Danny. And make no mistake, this is war. A war for the soul of this territory, for the future of our people. Either we win or they do. There's no middle ground. This isn't war, it's murder. It's survival. Samuel's finger tightened on the trigger, and you were always too soft to understand that, too willing to compromise, to coexist. That's why Father left the ranch to both of us instead of just you. He knew you didn't have the spine to do what was necessary. The words stung because they contained a grain of truth Daniel had always suspected. He'd never been the strong one, the decisive one. He'd always been Samuel's shadow, content to follow rather than lead. But not anymore. You're right, Daniel said, his hand moving slowly toward his gun. I am soft. I do want to coexist. And maybe that makes me weak in your eyes, but at least I can sleep at night. At least I don't have to keep a ledger of the dead to convince myself I'm righteous. Sleep. Samuel's voice dripped with contempt. You think I care about sleep? I care about legacy, about building something that will last after we're gone. These people, he gestured toward the pen, they're obstacles, weeds in the garden. You don't negotiate with weeds, Danny. You pull them out. Behind Samuel, Daniel saw movement, a shadow detaching from other shadows, moving with desperate purpose toward the pen. Maria. She'd heard the conversation, had used it as cover to get closer. Daniel needed to keep Samuel's attention just a little longer. Do you remember Mama? Daniel asked suddenly. Samuel blinked, thrown by the change in subject. What? Mama, do you remember what she used to say about treating people the way you'd want to be treated? Don't you dare bring her into this. She'd be ashamed of you. Daniel's voice was steady now, certain. Everything you've become, everything you've done, she'd be ashamed. And you know it. That's why you need that journal, why you write it all down with such care. You're trying to convince yourself it's righteous because deep down you know it's not. Samuel's face went white, then red. Shut your mouth. She died trying to help a Mexican family. Did you forget that the Garcias, when their baby was sick, Mama went to help deliver the child, caught fever, and died 3 days later? That's how I remember her giving her life to save someone else's. I said, shut up. Samuel's rifle wavered just slightly. You used to be like her. Daniel continued, taking a slow step forward. Before Father poisoned you with his hate, before you decided some people were worth less than others. You used to have a heart, Samuel. What happened to it? For just a moment, Daniel saw something flicker in his brother's eyes. Pain, doubt, the ghost of the boy he'd once been. Then it was gone, buried under layers of certainty and rage. You want to know what happened? Samuel's voice was quiet, dangerous. I woke up. I saw the world for what it really is, a battlefield. where only the strong survive. Mama's kindness got her killed. Father's hate kept us alive. I chose survival. You chose damnation. The fuse reached the powder shed. The explosion tore through the night, like the voice of God, a wall of sound and fury that knocked both men off their feet. Daniel felt the concussion slam into his chest, felt heat wash over him as the shed erupted in a pillar of fire that turned night into day. Debris rained down, burning wood, twisted metal fragments of barrel and crate. Daniel's ears rang as he pushed himself up, his vision swimming. Where Samuel had been standing there was only smoke and dust. Daniel scrambled for his gun, found it, brought it up with shaking hands. A figure emerged from the smoke. Samuel. Blood streaming from a cut on his forehead, his rifle lost in the chaos. They stared at each other across 10 feet of scorched earth, both of them reaching for their sidearms at the same time. Daniel was faster. The bullet caught Samuel in the shoulder, spinning him around. He went down hard, clutching at the wound, his face twisted in shock and pain. Around them, the compound had erupted into chaos. Men shouting, running, trying to understand what had happened. The fire from the destroyed shed was spreading, catching on nearby structures. And at the pen, Maria was tearing at the gate, while prisoners pressed against it from the inside. Daniel ran to help her, his boots pounding the hard-packed earth. Behind him, he could hear Samuel screaming orders, trying to rally his men. But the explosion had done its work. Half the crossmen were trying to fight the fire, the other half were looking for the attackers. "The lock!" Maria shouted when Daniel reached her. "I can't break the lock." Daniel raised his pistol and fired point blank at the chain holding the gate closed. It shattered and the gate swung open. Prisoners poured out like water from a broken dam, scattering in all directions. Some ran for the canyon entrance, others scrambled for the walls, desperate for any path to freedom. "Diego!" Maria pushed into the crowd, searching faces with frantic urgency. "Diego, where are you?" A gunshot cracked, and the man next to Daniel dropped. The crossmen had recovered from their shock and were firing into the fleeing prisoners. Daniel returned fire, providing cover as Maria searched. 3 shots, 4, his bullets finding targets with grim efficiency. Men fell screaming, clutching at wounds. Daniel felt nothing, no satisfaction, no remorse, just cold necessity. "Mama!" A child's voice, high and terrified, cut through the chaos. Maria whirled and Daniel saw her face transform, pure joy, pure relief. She shoved through the crowd and emerged with a small boy in her arms, his dark curls plastered to his head with sweat and tears. "Diego!" she sobbed, crushing him against her chest. "Oh God, Diego, baby, I've got you." "We need to move." Daniel grabbed Maria's arm, pulling her toward the side passage. "Now." They ran. Maria carried Diego despite her injuries, despite the pain that must have been screaming through her body. Daniel covered their retreat, firing behind them whenever a crossman got too close. The chaos was complete now, prisoners fleeing in all directions, crossmen trying to stop them, fire consuming the compound. It was exactly the confusion they'd needed. They'd almost reached the passage when Samuel appeared in front of them, materializing from the smoke like a demon from hell. His shoulder was soaked with blood, his face a mask of fury and pain. He raised his pistol with his good hand, aiming at Maria. "You should have stayed dead," he screamed. Daniel didn't think. He threw himself between Samuel and Maria, felt the bullet meant for her slam into his chest instead. The impact drove him backward, drove the air from his lungs. He hit the ground hard, staring up at the sky, where smoke and stars mingled in a terrible beauty. "Daniel!" Maria's voice seemed to come from very far away. He tried to answer, but blood filled his mouth. His chest felt like someone had placed a boulder on it, crushing down with inexorable weight. Through dimming vision, he saw Maria lower Diego to the ground, saw her raise the rifle with shaking hands. "This is for Carlos," she said, her voice cold as winter. "For Ana and Miguel and Rosa and every other person you murdered in God's name." Samuel smiled even as he bled. "You think killing me changes anything? There are a dozen more just like me ready to continue the work. You can't stop what's coming. Maybe not. Maria's aim never wavered. But I can stop you. The rifle shot echoed off the canyon walls. Samuel Cross jerked backward, a hole blooming red in the center of his chest. He looked down at it with something like surprise, then back up at Maria. You were supposed to die in that grave, he whispered. I know, Maria said. But I didn't. Samuel fell. The man who'd believed his hate was holy, who'd kept a journal of the dead like a twisted scripture, who'd tried to cleanse the desert with blood and fire, he fell and he didn't get back up. Maria dropped the rifle and rushed to Daniel's side. No, 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 stay with me. You hear me, Daniel Cross. You stay with me. Daniel tried to smile, though it felt more like a grimace. Diego, he managed. Get Diego out. Not without you. Maria. He coughed, tasted copper. Too late for me, but not for him, not for them. He gestured weakly toward the prisoners still fleeing into the desert. You saved them. You crawled out of your grave and saved them all. Shut up. You're not dying. I won't let you. Maria was crying now, her tears falling on Daniel's face like rain. You don't get to save me and then die. That's not how this works. Diego appeared beside his mother, his small face terrified. Mama, is he dead? No, baby, he's not dead. He's going to be fine. But Maria's hands were shaking as she pressed them against Daniel's wound, trying to stop the bleeding that wouldn't stop. Daniel looked at the boy, at his dark eyes so much like his mother's. 4 years old, and already he'd seen more violence than most people saw in a lifetime, but he was alive. Maria had crawled out of her grave, crossed a desert, and taken her son back from the men who'd stolen him. Listen to your mama, Daniel whispered to Diego. She's the bravest person I've ever known. Daniel, please. But the world was going gray at the edges, the sounds of fighting and fire fading to a distant roar. Daniel thought about his brother, about the boy Samuel had been before hate twisted him into something monstrous. Thought about his mother and her kindness, about his father and his rage. Thought about choices and consequences and the terrible weight of blood. And then he thought about Maria, who'd asked to be buried, but chose to live, who'd turned her grave into a garden and her pain into purpose. Get them out, he said one last time. Promise me. I promise, Maria sobbed. But you're coming with us, you hear me. You're coming with us. Daniel closed his eyes. The pain was fading now, replaced by a strange floating sensation, like being weightless, like being free. He heard Maria scream his name, felt her hands trying to hold him to the world, but gravity was losing its grip and Daniel Cross was letting go. The last thing he heard was Diego's small voice asking, Mama, why are you crying? And then there was nothing but darkness and the distant sound of rain. Except it wasn't raining in the desert. The sound Daniel heard was his own blood dripping onto the hard-packed earth. Each drop a second, each second a choice. To surrender or to fight. To let go or to hold on. Daniel had spent his whole life being the shadow to someone else's light. Following Samuel, obeying their father, keeping his head down and his opinions quiet. He'd watched evil happen and told himself it wasn't his responsibility to stop it. But lying there, feeling his life leak out, while Maria begged him to stay and Diego watched with terrified eyes, Daniel realized something. It wasn't about being brave or strong or righteous. It was about choosing in the moment that mattered most, which side of the line you stood on. And Daniel Cross, for the first time in his life, chose to fight. His hand found Maria's, gripped it with whatever strength he had left. The passage, he gasped. Drag me to the passage. Daniel, you can't do it. Maria looked at the side passage, maybe 50 feet away. Then at Diego, then at the crossmen still fighting throughout the compound. The mathematics of survival played across her face. She couldn't carry both Daniel and Diego, couldn't drag a dying man and protect her son at the same time. Go, Daniel said, seeing her calculation. Take Diego and go." "No." Maria's voice was steel. She turned to her son. "Diego, listen to me very carefully. You see that crack in the wall? I need you to run to it and wait for me there. Can you do that?" Diego nodded, his eyes huge with fear. "Good boy, run, now." The child ran, and Maria grabbed Daniel under the arms and started dragging. Every movement sent fresh agony through Daniel's chest, made the world spin and tilt. But Maria didn't stop, didn't slow. She hauled him across the ground with desperate strength, her face set in lines of absolute determination. They'd made it maybe 20 feet when one of the crossmen spotted them. He raised his rifle, aimed at Maria's back. Daniel still had his pistol. With the last of his strength, he raised it and fired. The shot went wide, missed the crossman completely, but it was enough to make the man duck to buy Maria a few more seconds. She dragged Daniel the final distance and rolled him into the passage. Diego was there, pressed against the wall, shaking with terror. Maria gathered both of them close, her back to the canyon, her body shielding them from view. "Stay quiet," she whispered to Diego. "Don't make a sound." They huddled there while the battle raged outside. Daniel could hear men shouting, could see the orange glow of fire reflected on the passage walls. The compound was destroying itself, torn apart by the very violence it had been built to celebrate. And as the sounds of fighting slowly faded, replaced by the crackle of flames and the moans of the wounded, Daniel felt his breathing grow easier. The crushing weight on his chest lifted slightly. Not gone, not healed, but manageable. "You're still with us," Maria whispered, checking his wound in the dim light. "The bullet went through, missed your heart, missed your lung. You beautiful, stupid, lucky man." Daniel tried to laugh, managed only a wet cough. "Lucky? Sure. You took a bullet for me, for us." Maria pressed her hand against the wound, tore a strip from her shirt, and bound it tight. "Why would you do that?" "Because you crawled out of your grave," Daniel said, "and I'll be damned if I let you get buried again." Diego touched Daniel's face with one small hand. "Thank you for saving my mama." "Your mama saved herself," Daniel told him. "I just helped a little." They stayed in the passage until the sounds outside dwindled to almost nothing, until the fire had consumed most of the compound and the crossmen had either fled or lay among the ruins. When Maria finally peered out, the canyon was a landscape of devastation. Buildings burned, bodies lay scattered, and the few crossmen who'd survived were stumbling away into the desert, their righteous mission reduced to ash and failure. The prisoners, those who'd survived, were helping each other toward the canyon entrance. Families reunited, strangers supporting strangers, all of them moving toward freedom, with the desperate urgency of people who knew how close they'd come to death. "Can you walk?" Maria asked Daniel. "I can try." With Maria on one side and Diego on the other, Daniel managed to stand. Every step was agony, every breath a labor. But he walked. Out of the passage, through the ruins, past the body of his brother, lying in the dust with that terrible smile finally erased. Daniel didn't look at Samuel's face, didn't stop to close his eyes or say a prayer. There was nothing left to say. Samuel had made his choices, had written his own ending in blood and fire. Now he was just another body in the desert waiting for the sand to cover him. They reached the canyon entrance as dawn was breaking, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. The surviving prisoners had gathered there, maybe 20 of them, waiting uncertainly for what came next. Maria stood before them, still holding Diego, and spoke in Spanish and then English. "The crossmen are broken. The compound is destroyed. You're free to go home, to rebuild, to live." She paused, her voice catching. "And I'm sorry. Sorry we couldn't save everyone. Sorry it took so long." An old woman stepped forward, touched Maria's face with a weathered hand. "Hija," she said softly, "you crawled out of death itself to save us. There is nothing to apologize for." Others came forward then, touching Maria, thanking her, blessing her in languages Daniel didn't understand, but whose meaning was clear. And Daniel, watching this woman who'd begged to be buried become a symbol of survival and resistance, felt something unknot in his chest. They'd won. Not completely, not perfectly. Samuel was dead, but his journal remained evidence of crimes that would likely never see justice. The crossmen were scattered, but others like them would rise to take their place. And the desert was still unforgiving, still hungry for the blood of anyone foolish enough to think they could tame it. But today, in this moment, they'd won. 40 people had walked into that canyon as prisoners. 20 were walking out free. It was enough. It had to be enough. Maria found Daniel sitting against a rock as the survivors dispersed, heading back toward their homes or toward new lives in safer places. She lowered Diego to the ground, and the boy immediately curled up and fell asleep, exhausted beyond words. "We should go," Maria said, sitting beside Daniel. "Get you to a doctor before that wound festers." In a minute, Daniel watched the sun climb higher, watched the desert wake to another day of heat and hardship and unexpected beauty. "I just need to sit here and remember what it feels like to be alive." Maria took his hand, and they sat together in the growing light, two people who'd survived their graves and learned that sometimes the only way out of hell is straight through it. The doctor in the town of Gila Bend was a grizzled man named Henderson, who'd seen enough gunshot wounds to fill a cemetery. He cleaned Daniel's injury with whiskey that burned worse than the bullets, stitched him up with thread meant for saddles, and pronounced him lucky to be breathing. "Another inch to the left and you'd be having this conversation with St. Peter," Henderson said, wrapping Daniel's chest in clean bandages. "As it is, you're going to hurt like hell for a month and probably set off every time it rains for the rest of your life. But you'll live." Daniel nodded, too exhausted to do more than grunt his thanks. Maria sat in the corner of the small office, Diego asleep in her arms, watching the proceedings with hollow eyes. She hadn't slept since the canyon hadn't let Diego out of her sight for more than a minute. The shadows under her eyes had shadows of their own. "You need rest too," Henderson told her, noting her pallor. "When's the last time you ate?" "I don't remember," Maria admitted. "Well, my wife's cooking supper. You'll stay, both of you, and eat something that isn't dried beef and desperation." It wasn't a request. They stayed. Henderson's wife, a kind woman named Ruth, who asked no questions and offered no judgments, fed them stew thick with vegetables and bread still warm from the oven. Diego ate like he'd been starving, which he probably had been. Maria picked at her food, her eyes distant, seeing things Ruth and Henderson couldn't. That night, they slept in the doctor's spare room. Diego curled between them like a small anchor, his breathing deep and peaceful in a way that seemed impossible given everything he'd witnessed. But children were resilient, Daniel thought. They had to be. Maria, though, didn't sleep. Daniel could feel her lying awake beside her son, could hear the soft sounds she made when she thought no one was listening. Grief finally given room to breathe. For her husband Carlos, for the families lost at the mission, for the years of peace that violence had stolen. Daniel wanted to comfort her, but didn't know how. What words existed for the kind of pain she carried? So he simply lay there, his own body screaming with each breath, and kept vigil alongside her through the long desert night. 3 days they stayed with the Hendersons while Daniel healed enough to travel. During that time, word spread about what had happened at the canyon. The few crossmen who'd survived told wild stories. Some claimed they'd been attacked by dozens of Mexican soldiers. Others said it was Apache warriors seeking revenge. None admitted the truth that 2 people and a barrel of gunpowder had destroyed everything Samuel Cross had built. The official story, the one the territorial marshal accepted when he arrived to investigate, was that the crossmen had been fighting among themselves over stolen gold, and the whole thing had gone up in flames. The freed prisoners had scattered so completely that by the time authorities went looking for them, there was no one to contradict the narrative. Samuel's body was identified, buried in an unmarked grave, and forgotten. His journal, though, that Daniel kept. He'd found it in the ruins, protected by a metal box. that had survived the fire. Every page documented every crime catalogued in Samuel's neat handwriting. Daniel knew he should turn it over to the authorities, use it as evidence to bring the surviving crossmen to justice. But he also knew it wouldn't matter. The men Samuel had murdered were Mexican native or Chinese. The people who made the laws didn't much care about their deaths. The journal would be filed away and forgotten, another piece of inconvenient history buried in a dusty office. So Daniel made a different choice. On their last night in Gila Bend, he sat by the fire and read the journal one final time, memorizing the names of the dead bearing witness to the crimes that would never see official justice. Then he placed it in the flames and watched his brother's legacy burn to ash. "What are you doing?" Maria had appeared beside him, drawn by the firelight. "Letting go," Daniel said, watching the pages curl and blacken. "Samuel wanted to be remembered, wanted his works to last. I'm not giving him that." Maria was silent for a long moment. Then she said, "The people he killed deserve to be remembered." "They do, but not like this, not as entries in a madman's diary." Daniel looked at her, at the firelight dancing across her face. "We'll remember them properly. We'll make sure what happened matters." "How?" Daniel didn't have an answer yet. But watching those pages burn, he felt something settle in his chest. Not peace, he'd never have that, not completely. But purpose, direction, a sense that the story wasn't over, that there was still work to be done. They left Gila Bend as the autumn rains began, the first moisture the desert had seen in months. Diego rode in front of Maria, chattering with the boundless energy of a child who'd decided the worst was over. He asked questions about everything, the plants, the animals, where they were going, what they would eat. Maria answered with patience. Daniel found remarkable, given everything she'd endured. They rode back to Daniel's ranch first to collect supplies and decide what came next. The place looked smaller than Daniel remembered, more weathered. 3 weeks away, and it already felt like somewhere he'd lived in a different life. "It's peaceful," Maria observed, watching Diego run circles around the yard, delighting in open space and freedom. "It's isolated," Daniel corrected. "I came out here to hide, and now I think hiding's done." Daniel looked at the mountains to the north, toward the canyon where his brother had died and 40 people had been freed. There are more men like Samuel out there, more compounds, more violence justified by righteousness. Someone needs to stop them. The law won't do it. No, the law is too slow, too corrupt, too willing to look away when the victims don't matter to the people in power. Daniel turned to Maria. "But we could. We know what to look for now, how they operate. We could find them before they destroy more families." Maria studied him with those dark eyes that had seen death and chosen life anyway. "You're talking about hunting them, about becoming exactly what you condemned Samuel for." "No. Samuel killed innocent people and called it cleansing. I'm talking about stopping murderers before they can kill again. That's different." "Is it?" Maria's voice was soft but challenging. "Where's the line, Daniel? When does justice become revenge? When does necessary violence become the very thing you're fighting against?" It was a question Daniel had been wrestling with since he'd shot his own brother. He didn't have a good answer, wasn't sure a good answer existed. "I don't know," he admitted, but I know doing nothing is wrong. I hid for 3 years while Samuel murdered people. I won't make that mistake again." Maria looked at Diego playing in the dust with a stick and his boundless imagination. "I spent 2 days in a grave begging to die. When you pulled me out, I thought you'd saved me for nothing, that I'd rather be dead than live with what I'd lost." She paused, her voice thick with emotion. "But then I held Diego again, felt his heart beating against mine, and I realized something. The best revenge against people like Samuel isn't becoming like them. It's building something they couldn't destroy, creating life where they created death." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying there are 20 families who survived that canyon because of you and me. 20 families who need somewhere safe to go, somewhere to rebuild. What if we gave them that? What if instead of hunting men like Samuel, we built something that proved them wrong? Daniel looked at his small ranch, at the empty land stretching in all directions. It could support maybe 5 people, 10 if they were careful. But if they expanded, if they brought in help, if they turned this isolated hiding place into something bigger. The old mission, Maria continued, her voice growing stronger. It's destroyed now, but the land is still there. Water, good soil, buildings that could be rebuilt. We could make it a refuge, a place where people like my family, people the Crossmen targeted, could live without fear. That's a beautiful dream, Maria, but dreams don't stop bullets. Nah, but they give people something worth surviving for. She met his eyes. You want to honor the dead, don't become another killer. Become a builder. Help us create something that lasts longer than Samuel's hate. Daniel felt the weight of her words settling into his bones. She was right, he knew. Hunting down the Crossmen would feel righteous, would scratch the itch for vengeance that still burned in his chest. But it would also consume him, turn him into the very thing he despised. All right, he said finally. We'll try it your way. We'll build something. The smile that broke across Maria's face was like sunrise after a long night. They spent the winter planning, gathering supplies, and sending word through the scattered networks of Mexican families that there was a place being built for them. A haven where the color of your skin or the language you spoke didn't determine your worth. Where children could play without fear and families could rebuild what violence had stolen. They called it Estrella Haven, after Maria's family name. Star Haven for people who'd lost their way and needed light to guide them home. The survivors from the canyon came first, bringing their skills and their stories. Farmers who knew how to coax life from reluctant soil. Carpenters who could build homes from desert scrub and determination. Women who knew healing herbs and old songs. Children who still remembered how to laugh despite everything they'd seen. Diego thrived among them, his nightmares fading as he made friends and found purpose helping the older children with chores. He never spoke about his time with the Crossmen, but sometimes Daniel would catch him staring at the northern mountains with an expression too old for his young face. He'll carry it always, Maria told Daniel one evening as they watched the boy play. What he saw, what he survived. But maybe here, surrounded by people who survived too, he'll learn to carry it without being crushed by the weight. Is that what you're doing? Learning to carry it? Maria touched the scar on her shoulder, hidden now beneath her dress, but never forgotten. Every day. Some days are harder than others, but then I see this. She gestured at the growing settlement, at families working together to build homes and plant gardens, and I remember why I climbed out of that grave. Spring came early that year, bringing rain that turned the desert green and filled the river higher than anyone could remember. The mission buildings rose from their ruins, rebuilt with stronger walls and wider doors. The church they transformed into a meeting hall where all faiths were welcome and none were mandatory. The old bell tower became a school where children learned reading and arithmetic in Spanish and English both. Daniel found himself settling into a role he'd never imagined. Not a leader exactly, but a protector. He taught the men to shoot not for violence, but for defense. Showed them how to build defenses without building prisons, how to stay vigilant without living in fear. And at night he'd sit with the elders and listen to their stories, learning the histories that Samuel's journal had reduced to numbers and dates. One evening, as Daniel was helping frame a new barn, a stranger rode into Estrella Haven. He was dusty from travel, his clothes marking him as a man of some means. He dismounted and asked to speak with whoever was in charge. Maria met him in the yard, Daniel standing quietly behind her. The stranger looked surprised to see a woman in authority, but he recovered quickly. "My name is Thomas Garrett," he said. "I'm a journalist from San Francisco. I've been hearing stories about this place, about what happened at the canyon." Daniel felt his hand move toward his gun. If this man had come to expose them, to paint Maria as a murderer and Daniel as a vigilante, "I want to tell the truth," Garrett continued. The real story, not the lies the territorial government is spreading, about the crossmen, about what they did, about how you stopped them. He pulled a notebook from his saddlebag. I've been investigating Samuel Cross for 2 years. I know about the murders, the burned settlements, all of it. But I never had proof, never had witnesses willing to talk. Until now. Maria and Daniel exchanged looks. This was dangerous territory inviting scrutiny from the outside world, but it was also an opportunity. What do you want from us? Maria asked. The truth. Your story. Not to glorify violence or turn you into heroes, but to bear witness. To make sure what happened matters, that the dead aren't forgotten. Garrett looked around at the growing settlement, and to show people that there's another way, that hate doesn't have to win. They talked long into the night, Daniel and Maria sharing their story, while Garrett took notes. They didn't tell him everything. Some things were too painful, too personal, but they told him enough. About the massacre at the mission, about Maria's grave, about the canyon and the freed prisoners, about Samuel's journal and the choice to burn it, rather than let his hate live on as history. When Garrett finally left 2 days later, his saddlebags full of notes and his heart full of purpose, he clasped both their hands. What you're building here, he said, this is the real story. Not the violence, not the revenge, but this. People choosing life over death, community over isolation, hope over hate. He mounted his horse, then paused. I'll make sure the world knows, not just about what you destroyed, but about what you're creating. The article appeared 3 months later in papers across California and Arizona. From graves to gardens, the Estrella Haven story. It told of atrocities committed and justice delayed, but also of resilience and renewal. Of a woman who crawled from her own grave to save her son and 40 others. Of a man who faced his brother's evil and chose building over bloodshed. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Donations arrived, money, supplies, offers of help, but also threats. Anonymous letters promising that the Crossmen's work wasn't finished, that Mexican-loving traitors would get what they deserved. Daniel increased the watch, taught more people to defend themselves, and waited for violence that thankfully never came. Instead, more refugees arrived. Families fleeing persecution, individuals seeking purpose, people who'd heard that somewhere in the Arizona desert was a place where who you were mattered more than what you looked like or where you came from. Estrella Haven grew. 20 families became 40, then 60. What had started as a refuge became a community, then a town. They dug irrigation ditches and planted orchards, built a real school with a teacher who'd fled Mexico City after speaking out against corruption, established a clinic where Ruth Henderson came monthly to train local healers, and in the center of it all, where the old mission church had once stood, they planted palm trees. 7 of them, 1 for each family murdered at the original San Miguel mission. Maria tended them personally, watering them through the brutal summers, protecting them from frost in the rare cold winters. Diego, now 6 and growing like a weed, helped his mother with the palms. He'd ask her to tell him about his father Carlos, about the grandparents he'd never known, about the life that violence had stolen. And Maria would tell him, keeping those memories alive not as wounds, but as legacies. Your father was brave, she'd say, her hands gentle in the soil. He died protecting you. That's what real courage looks like, not the kind that hurts others, but the kind that shields them. Daniel would watch these moments from a distance, still not quite sure of his place in this family they'd cobbled together from trauma and necessity. But then Maria would catch his eye and smile, or Diego would run over demanding Daniel teach him to rope like a real rancher, and he'd feel the tight places in his chest loosen a little more. 2 years after the canyon, on a spring morning when the palms were finally tall enough to cast real shade, Daniel found Maria sitting beneath them with her eyes closed and her face turned to the sun. Peaceful, he asked, settling beside her. I was just thinking, Maria said, not opening her eyes, about that day you found me, when I begged you to bury me. I think about it too. I was so certain I was supposed to die, that death was the only escape from the pain. She opened her eyes, looked at the settlement spreading around them, at children playing and families working and life insisting on itself despite everything. I was wrong. You were traumatized. I was giving up. Maria's voice was firm. And you didn't let me. You pulled me out of that grave and made me keep living even when I didn't want to. I hated you for it at first. And now, Maria took his hand, her grip warm and strong. Now I understand that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is refuse to let someone surrender, even when they're begging you to. They sat in silence, watching Diego chase a lizard through the garden, while the palms swayed overhead. The scars Maria carried, physical and otherwise, would never fully fade. Neither would Daniel's guilt over his brother's crimes or his grief over the man Samuel could have been. But scars were proof of survival, Maria had once told him. Evidence that you'd been hurt and healed, broken and rebuilt. They didn't make you beautiful, but they made you real. I've been thinking, Daniel said carefully, about what happens next. Estrella Haven is stable now, doesn't really need me anymore. Maria's hand tightened on his. Where would you go? Nowhere, I'm not leaving. He turned to face her. But I thought maybe it was time to build something more permanent. A real house, not just the temporary one we've been sharing. Maybe a home big enough for a family. He watched understanding dawn in Maria's eyes, followed by something that might have been joy or might have been terror. Probably both. Daniel Cross, she said slowly. Are you asking what I think you're asking? I'm not good with words, never have been. But these past 2 years watching you build this place, watching you turn pain into purpose and graves into gardens. He took a breath. You make me want to be better than I am. And Diego, he needs a father figure. And I know I'm not. Carlos could never replace him, but Maria kissed him, soft and sudden and tasting of tears and sunlight. Yes, she said when they broke apart. Whatever you were working up to, asking yes. Diego chose that moment to run over Lizard, triumphantly captured in his small hands. Look, I caught him. Can we keep him? Absolutely not, Maria said, but she was laughing. But Mama, the lizard needs to be free, baby, just like we needed to be free from the bad men. Diego considered this with the seriousness only a 6-year-old could muster, then nodded and released the lizard. It scurried away into the garden, and Diego immediately spotted something else that needed investigating. He's going to be a handful, Daniel observed. He already is. But he's alive and healthy and loved, and that's more than I dared hope for when I was lying in that grave. Maria stood, pulling Daniel up with her. Come on, if we're building a house, we should probably figure out where to put it. They walked through Estrella Haven together, 3 people who'd survived their graves and built something beautiful from the ashes of violence. All around them, life continued its stubborn insistence on existing. Gardens grew where blood had been spilled. Children laughed where crosses had once marked the dead, and palm trees swayed in the desert wind, their shadows no longer graves but shelters, their presence not a monument to death but a promise of renewal. That night, after Diego had fallen asleep, Daniel and Maria stood on the porch of their temporary home and looked up at the stars. Do you think he's watching? Maria asked. Samuel, I mean, do you think he sees what we've built? I don't know, maybe. Daniel considered the question seriously. If there's justice in the afterlife, I hope he sees it. Hope he understands that his hate didn't win, that the people he tried to destroy are thriving. Is that enough? For you, I mean, not hunting down the others, not seeking revenge. Daniel thought about the journal burning, about the choice he'd made to build instead of destroy. Some days it feels like enough. Others I still want to ride out and make them all pay. But then I come home to this, to you and Diego and everyone we've helped, and I remember the best revenge against hate is refusing to let it make you hateful. Maria leaned against him, and Daniel wrapped his arm around her shoulders. They stood like that for a long time. Two people who'd learned that graves didn't have to be endings, that crosses could mark not death, but crossroads, that even in the harshest desert, mercy could bloom into something that looked a lot like redemption. The palms Maria had planted would outlive them all, Daniel knew, would grow tall and strong, would provide shade for generations not yet born, would stand as silent witnesses to the truth that life always finds a way to return where compassion is planted. And someday, when their own stories had faded into legend and the names of the dead had been forgotten by all but the desert wind, those palms would remain 7 green flames in the wilderness, burning not with hate but with hope, reminding anyone who saw them that even the deepest graves can become gardens if you're brave enough to plant something beautiful in the soil of shared pain.